Good evening, everyone. My name is Oscar Schultz. I'm a rising junior at Harvard College, and I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee, zooming in from Cologne, Germany tonight. Welcome to the Institute of Politics Fast Forum Summer Series. This summer, the IOP continues to support Harvard students across the globe who share a sense of purpose to make a difference for our nation and world. While we cannot join together in person, technology allows us to convene virtually, and bringing fast forums online allows us to share Harvard University's premier arena for political speech, discussion, and debate across many states and countries. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our guests tonight, and my special honor to welcome my country's ambassador to the United States, the German ambassador, Emily Haber. Ambassador was appointed in June 2018. Prior to being appointed ambassador, she's held several foreign service roles. And in 2011, she was appointed state secretary at the Federal Ministry of the Interior. In this position, she oversaw security and migration at the height of the European refugee crisis. She was also the first woman in this position. Emily Haber attended schools in New Delhi, Bonn, Paris, Brussels, Washington, and Athens, and earned her PhD at the University of Cologne, from where I'm zooming in tonight. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Fred Hochberg. He was a chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States from 2009 to 2017 under the Obama administration. He was also the longest-serving chairman of the institution in the institution's history. After having spent almost 2 decades in the private sector, Mr. Hochberg served as acting administrator of the Small Business Administration under President Clinton. He also served as dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy at the New School in New York City, and is an IOP Fellow at the Kennedy School. So I thank you both for agreeing to be with us tonight and welcome you to the JFK Junior Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you for joining us. Ambassador, good to see you again. It's good to be introduced by a German national because the name Hochberg is easily pronounced that way, which is not always the case. And just a quick thank you. I was a fellow when Mark Guerin joined the IOP as director, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And I will just say, as a result, my forum was about trade, and I, as a result of that outcome, wrote this book and published it. So I am eternally grateful to the many, many students who are work with the fellows at the Institute of Politics. So this series just briefly started. This is the 3rd year. The first 2 years were in person. This year we're doing a special one night only. It's like a concert, a one night only concert. And we will have about 30 minutes. So the ambassador and I will talk for 10, 12 minutes, then we can open it up for questions. One of the first things that comes to mind, Ambassador, is both the United States, we have many things in common, but we're both federal systems. And one thing we've seen in our country is the response to the COVID-19 crisis has been very much a function of that federal system, where different states and governors and sometimes mayors have taken a different path than those just over the border in another state. So with that as backdrop, how do you see changes in social interaction and the economy in Germany as we move through this COVID crisis and begin to look at the other side of it?
First, to your point on the federal systems, yes, the federal system, we have both federal systems. It is in both our cases the federal states that have the responsibility for healthcare. Decisions are being taken there and on local levels. I would say, though, that the institutional setup is different insofar as we have an established system for coordination while the states are responsible, the institutional setup for coordination made sure that all were on the same page. We never had a patchwork. Well, to some extent, in minor cases, yes. But overall, there was a general sense of consensus and of unity that moving forward, all had to sing from the same page, because otherwise, in one place where things were going well, they would be revisited, because in another place they wouldn't. So the degree of coordination, possibly, by the way, reinforced by the experience of the migration crisis in 2015 and 2016, where all of these, the early lack of coordination has really shaped a very strong sense of urgency for this very coordination in the times of crisis. I worked, Oscar pointed out, at the Interior Ministry at the time, and I do remember the steep learning curve in coordinating and adjusting how important that was, as it was to actually all resources needed there were they being needed. So that's one issue. You were asking how are we moving forward and what are the lessons learned? The first lesson learned was also one from an earlier crisis, and that was 2008. When we took economic decisions such as tax deferral, short-term working allowances, which was one of the key elements of the economic plans, that is keeping people in their jobs, and making sure that they would receive something between 60 and 67% of their earlier incomes, making sure that they would not lose the jobs, enhancing entitlement for these programs. These were a lesson back from 2008, and we just had to return to the structures we had set up then in order to tackle with the present crisis. What else? We have also learned, we've learned a lot, perhaps you will ask that as well, in terms of value chains. In the early phases of the crisis, we felt painfully that very complex value chains in terms of emergency can actually be an impediment for combating the challenge you're confronted with. So we'll have to think through now very carefully what this will mean. It can't mean reshoring all production, but we'll have to look at value chains for PSP, for medical equipment, for medicine. And a fourth lesson we've made is there were protection deficits, not only, actually everywhere in the world. In Bangladesh, for example, when huge companies, textile companies, cancelled all their orders, a huge amount of workers in factories, of traders, lost their job and had nothing. And we had similar protection deficits in the north, where huge delivery companies employed workers in their on their grounds, where they assembled the products in order to get them delivered. There were protection deficits there too, or meat companies. Right now in Germany, we have a huge case that is really looming large. So the lesson we drew from that is, if you factor in human rights due diligence aspects in management mission statements, you'll find that value chains will be more resilient and more sustainable. And lastly, a European lesson was in the very early phases of the crisis, we were very inward looking, and we concentrated on, we focused on what was needed in Germany itself. This came at a price, which we quickly realized, because this crisis was so existential, as you can see in the iconographic imagery of the coffins in northern Italy, that we realized if we do not turn to solidarity and actually turn the tables, then the long-term price tag will be a European one. And it was this moment when we all changed track, both in terms of medical support and in terms of economic recovery program. And there we entered into a thinking that was unfathomable before. We are discussing in Europe right now a one-off sort of mutualization of debt, unthinkable in 2008, which would mean that the Commission would actually be able to raise money on financial markets and hand it out as credits and grants to European member states. So that's really a paradigm shift. So if you ask me about changes, where will they occur as lessons learned from the COVID crisis, I would say here are some.
That's excellent, and that gives a lot of insight. Let me shift slightly because, and you'll need to explain a little bit to our students, because unfortunately, I think Americans, not just students, we are far less knowledgeable about how other countries do their politics than other countries are about our politics. Sometime early next week, July 1st, you will become, not you personally, but Germany will become president of the EU Council. So perhaps you could explain a little bit what that means. And it certainly comes at a very pivotal time when, as you just mentioned in your last comments, how the European idea, the European project and the solidarity is sort of at risk. But maybe first explain the EU Council and what that means being president for 6 months.
The EU presidency has altered its role in the wake of the Lisbon Treaty. Before, it really shaped the agenda and led the negotiations. Now it's more of an agenda setting, but obviously, whether you prepare a presidency well and whether you come into this presidency with a certain clout will have an impact on the way negotiations are being led. And this will be an important presidency because we have to deal with the impact of the crisis, the pandemic. We'll have to not reorganize the health sector, but we'll have to reorganize our thinking on public procurement for medical equipment, strategic stocks for medical equipment, for PSP, etc. We'll have to alter the procurement activities vis-a-vis the pharmaceutical industries. It will give us a stronger voice. We'll have to set up systems which will allow us to use data which are actually interoperable, which I can easily see. We all operate with a lot of data on illnesses and so forth right now. I know they're all not really comparable. So we'll have to change that in Europe. That's the health sector. Then the economic sector, I already alluded to it. It will be a huge recovery program. I cannot give you numbers as yet. And there's lots still under negotiation and different countries are pulling into different directions. But what is basically clear is that we'll see the Commission raise a lot of money on the international markets. Member states will have to pay back according to their share in the budget over a long period of time. And it's the first one-off opportunity because it's so existential that it is a sort of mutualization of debt. It's not Eurobonds because it's member states that raise the money. It's the Commission, but it's a shift of paradigm. And it doesn't come out of nowhere. We've done a lot before that already in the first recovery program when we flexibilized the system and when the EIB and the ECB and the Commission made available a lot of liquidity for those hit hard. And then this is twofold. There will be also the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, which is closely interlinked to the recovery program. Multi-annual financial framework means the 7-year term budget of the European Union, which will look completely different than we had imagined a couple of months ago. So we're in a really completely new chapter. And then lastly, there is a consensus or a broad understanding that we'll have to use the crisis also in order to push forward into directions that we had identified as important before. Climate change or green recovery, reduction of emissions. All of that will happen now faster than anticipated. And
Right.
we'll have to think about linking Green and New Deals and reduction plans to policy issues, to programs, etc. And lastly, digitization is another issue. Here again, we'll use the crisis as an opening for doing things that would have happened perhaps over a longer run of time. In this vein, the crisis really has turned out to be an accelerant for opportunities as well.
Right. I'm going to bring some of our students in. Our first question is from, I hope I pronounced your name right. If I don't, please correct me. Vasilis is going to ask the first question. Did I do okay?
Absolutely, you did. Hello,
Okay.
and thank you so much. This is Vasilis Koutifaris from the Center for European Studies at Harvard. Ambassador, what are the prospects of the EU member states agreeing on the bold recovery fund that was proposed? And how will that shape the European Union as an institution going forward?
Well, I was part of a discussion yesterday evening with someone who wrote a book on international politics, and in this book had written that the European Union was on a path of structural decline. And in that event, he said, I don't think he knew I was present, but anyway, he said he didn't think this anymore because he felt that European member states, there's no consensus as yet, you're right, European member states had really jettisoned traditional orthodoxies in order to confront a crisis which is really existential. And I think that's right. And you see, France and Germany are often criticized when we move forward with a plan because we're two large countries in Europe and it sounds like a pretty, dominating effort, but it's not. France and Germany do, from very different vantage points on economics, on how to do business, on economies, actually. And if we manage coming from different vantage points, actually to bridge our differences, it usually means that this is at least a point of departure for emerging consensus in Europe. We're not there yet. There are different interests, but I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to overcome them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to have favorites, but I do, is Vivian Thomas, who worked with me when I was a fellow and is also from Germany, and she's going to ask the next question.
Sure. You will have to excuse that I'm not using video because this is not my time anymore, it being 1 o'clock here. Anyway, I was wondering, with recent tensions also between the US and Germany in the face of President Trump announcing that he would have troops relocated in Europe, to put it that way, how do you see the situation evolving, especially with the role of NATO and potential Russian aggressions in the following?
Well, the observation here is in place that no, I'll start differently. We have a number of disagreements, that's true. And some of them are not new, they are pretty aged ones. The one on burden sharing, for example, in the 1980s, and I do remember that, there was a lot of dispute on burden sharing and on it was then the 3% goal. We have discussed about gas pipelines since the 1970s. We have had disputes on protectionism and trade deficits or surpluses since a long time. So I will always argue that we have a lot of experience in Washington and in Berlin and in Brussels in dealing with these issues. And I don't think that they have a long-term structural impact on the relationship. I worry about something else. I worry about something that COVID-19 has actually also accelerated, and that is the growing sense, not only in the United States, but also in other countries, that the landscape of international institutions and organizations and treaties and agreements, or the mere fact of allies and alliances, are something that are actually containing American potential, or even preventing America to pursue its own interests. And it is this where we actually start to look at the world through different prisms, and I worry about that. The United States, if it decides to look at the world in a very transactionalist vein, perhaps it can, because it's the single most powerful country in the world. But even the United States is never only in bilateral situations. It will also be in multilateral situation, and it will see that other actors, less benign ones, will leverage their partners or those that are close to them against American bilateral power. And as far as medium-sized countries or small countries are concerned, I think they would all say the same, and that is we depend on international predictability and transparency. And that is promised by international organizations and institutions and rules and regulations and treaties. And all of them may be flawed and all of them may be improvable, but it promises a system of parameters which allows us to act. And believe me, for a country like Germany, which is one of the most globalized countries in the world, look, over 40% of our GDP comes from trade. We depend on that. We cannot decide to go bilateral because we would be infinitely weaker. And here is where NATO comes in as well. NATO and the EU and like-minded and bilateral partners. We need all of them because it allows us to leverage collective power against those that are challenging the way we want to live, that are challenging our values, that are challenging our democracies and the way and our identities, actually. So my answer to you is I don't agree with the reasoning that I sometimes hear that Germany is actually not paying debts or being delinquent in NATO. We're not. We are one of the closest transatlantic partners. And being in Europe and being in Germany is actually doing something for transatlantic security. It is deterring Russia. It is bolstering the security of NATO allies, and actually it is also there to project American power in Africa, in Middle East, in the Near East, because right. From Germany, where many of these organizations, countries, or even missions are being coordinated from.
Thank you. That was very, very insightful. Thank you. I think our next question is from Sandy from Harvard College.
Hi.
How are you, Sandy?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. Very good to see you. You've been fishing, I see behind you.
Yeah. And thank you, Ambassador, so much for joining us. My question is about the U.S.-Germany relationship, specifically concerning former Ambassador Richard Grenell, who was ambassador to Germany and is now adopted many other positions in the administration. And I'm curious sort of how you view that relationship as having affected U.S.-Germany relations, and how you see sort of the Trump administration and Germany and that relationship moving forward in the future.
Well, I only say this. He did his job. He did what he was requested and required to do. And I believe that members of the administration will tell me that he did it very effectively. That's all I will say. Now, as to the future of the
very diplomatic.
Well, I am a diplomat. It was also a candid answer. As far as the future of the relationship is concerned, I always advise people, and I tell my staff, look at structural differences and look at long-term trend differences. One may be urgent and perhaps important, but the long-term trends that will alter or affect a relationship, such as the different perception of, well, I hate the word because it's got too many syllables, but the long-term implications of accepting multilateralism and using it to our collective benefit, that's more relevant. Can I also say, perhaps, you see, there is a German constitutional lawyer, Böckenförde, and he developed something that's called the Böckenförde paradox. What it basically says that in a liberal and secular state, a democratic state, the state does not have the capacity to enforce well, liberalism, diversity, and the respect and tolerance of diversity. It cannot, because it depends on people to actually live it. And it occurs to me that the same is true for the West too, because the West as a group of nations aligned, all of them democracies, and respecting a rule of law. The degree in which we are credible and persuasive in that will depend on the credibilities of how we uphold our values, how we uphold democracy in our countries, how we uphold a rule of law in our countries, but it also will depend on the way we interact with one another as democracies. That's what's called soft power. And believe me, I served in Russia a couple of times, and the Soviet Union for that matter too. And if you've done that, and if you've observed international politics from Moscow, you will see they don't have allies. They don't have alliances. They're pretty much alone. And it was our competitive, huge advantage to be in a large group of countries aligned and allied. And we interacted differently.
I have a question. I'm going to read the last one, but two things you said I wanted to just comment on. One, Madeleine Albright has a favorite saying that she said, the problem with multilateralism is too many syllables and it ends in an ism, which Americans don't like. And when you talk about allies, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, was in China in around 2007, 2008. And a senior minister, I'll try and protect those who are in the room, but said, well, the United States, you have all the good allies. You know, we don't, meaning our allies are North Korea and Cambodia. And that is not a way to try and have influence around the world. Exactly. So let me read the last question, which is a perfect question, which clearly you have inspired our students. Sama said she'd like me to read her question. What advice do you have for those aspiring to become ambassadors like you, joining the Foreign Service, and what kind of path might you take right from college to sort of consider this pathway forward?
Well, if you want to do that, know this. You need to be interested in interacting with people, because that's a large part of the job. Yeah, you know, you have to know your dossiers, but interacting with people is hugely important, and you must be fond of that. You must be able, and not everyone does that, but it's crucial for diplomacy. You must be able to place yourself in the shoes of your counterpart, because you see, even if he disagrees with you, from his point of view or her point of view, he or she will not be wrong. You just have different views. And you need to see, not always perhaps, but often, the subjective legitimacy of your counterpart's point of view. That's I believe, the only point of departure when you are heading for results that need to be negotiated. I always say, in a world that is not governed by policemen or judges, you actually need to compromise on issues where you would like to see a different outcome, but you cannot enforce it. So understanding that is hugely important.
Great, excellent. I'm going to go to Christian. Should we be wrapping up? Because I know we're trying to keep these to 30 minutes, and we're just about 30 minutes. So I'm going to ask either Christian or Kathy, tell me if we have any more questions or whether we're going to thank the ambassador and thank everybody for joining us.
Fred, I think we're all set to wrap up.
Okay, so Ambassador, thank you. We had a chance to meet almost a year ago when you hosted the Meridian International Center at dinner at your home. And I think it was the birth of one of your grandchildren that night, that very evening, and your husband did not join us. So, but thank you for taking the time to meet with our students. One of the things we try and do in this program, because being many students in Cambridge, there's a little less sometimes exposure to diplomacy and our ambassadors and sort of foreign affairs, and a little more emphasis on domestic issues. So this was a great insight. And I have had the chance to see you on a number of forums in the last 2 weeks. So I know that you've been very busy because I've been on a number of Zoom calls in the last few weeks. So thank you for your time. Do you have any parting thing you'd like to just say before we wrap up and call it an evening?
Well, yes, I'd like to say that all of you, the students, are going to make very important decisions and choices. And it will be up to you whether the world as it looks today will be a globalized world, or globalized is perhaps not the right word, but will be a world where cooperation and coordination and factoring in other people, other countries, other actors' interests in the benefit of a solution that is acceptable of solutions that are acceptable to as many as possible, or whether we're going to be a world more and more fragmented, where everyone says nations first, a policy that I believe will hit the most vulnerable countries more than it will hit the richer countries of the world. These are difficult choices and they're before you.
Well, I think that's a very good point to end on, because being in the United States and Germany, we can, as we try and navigate through this crisis, both the health crisis, we have a political crisis, and one of inequality, we're among the more fortunate in the entire world. So thank you also for making all of us fortunate to spend a half hour with you this evening. And thank you so much. I look forward to also getting to see you in person once we can do that again. So thank you to the Institute of Politics, to Mark Guerin, Christy Flynn, and the entire team there. And for those students who joined us this evening, thanks again. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.